Hello and welcome to the second lesson in how to make cut paper sculpture. So you might remember that last week we were looking at King House in Boyle, and we were looking particularly at these window shapes that are inside the house, and this was the cutout that we made. So using accordion folds and cuts, and now we're going to look at other reference in the house to add to our design. So using reference just means looking at other designed objects and using them as inspiration for our own. So the first thing I'm going to look at is this vase, which is in the collection of King House. And I'm going to zoom in here and look just at one section of a piece on the vase. So here I am drawing it out. So I've sped up my drawing to make it a little quicker. But you can see I'm just looking at that and drawing the shapes that I see. Next, I'm looking at this, which actually is the family crest for the King family name. And I'm just going to draw what I see. So at all times when I'm sketching out my ideas, I'm looking at the original image or the original design, but I'm sketching them out maybe more simply. I'm looking for things that have shapes in them that I think might work well as cutouts. So again, I've obviously sped up the drawing, so you can just see me drawing it here quickly. I always sketch things out before I make them into cutouts. So here I'm looking at a helmet from the Connacht Rangers, which is part of the collection of the house. And again, I'm just looking at parts of that design, sketching them out and starting to think, are there any shapes in there that could work well as a cutout? So if you remember from doing the first cutout last week, everything needs to be designed in kind of shapes. So I always draw them out by hand first, and for me that helps my mind kind of work out what's shapes and what's not. So here are my designs with the original reference images, and you can see if I take the images away one at a time, what I'm left with is just my own drawings. And so at the very end, I don't even look at the reference images, I just look at my drawings, and that's what I use to work on my cutout. Okay, so here I have three different things I've taken from designed objects within King House. Now I'm going to use those designs to cut out. Okay, so a little bit like last week, you take a sheet of paper. So this is usually just A4 photocopy paper. I'm going to fold it in two. So if you remember last week, we folded one in two when we were doing a test one, and then we made accordion folds. I'm just going to start with one fold, and keep in mind you can always add more folds as you go along. So here's my first fold. I'm going to look at my design and have a think about what part of that design would I cut out first. I always start with the part that I think is the simplest or easiest, whatever I'm most sure about. So for me, I'm going to look at the shape that I drew from the vase, and I'm going to design a little cutout based on that. So keep in mind, as before, you're drawing your design on the fold. So you're always cutting on the fold. So what you're drawing is going to be doubled up. And I'm not drawing exactly the full design. I'm just taking parts of it that I think might work. Okay? You're working with photocopy paper here, so experiment. You can do things, if they don't work, you usually understand after cutting something that doesn't work, you understand what works and what doesn't. So it's much easier to figure out what does work by making mistakes. So use a few sheets of paper. Don't be afraid to do it a couple of times, get it wrong, or do something that almost works but doesn't quite work, and then come back and you know how to start again. Okay? All learning is based around trying something, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and then that's kind of how you learn what's the best way to do something. So you can see here when I'm cutting into the fold. I'm cutting an awful lot from the fold inwards. I try and make my cuts nice and sharp. Also, when cutting like this, if at any time I cut something in and I'm not sure if my original drawing, so I've drawn obviously onto my sheet here, if I'm not sure that my original drawing is perfect, I can change it when I go to cut. Okay? And I don't know if you can see here, it's easy to see. I make sure that I'm leaving gaps between each of my cutout elements so there's something still holding the page together. Okay, it's very easy to cut a little bit too much and the whole thing flops out. So at all times make sure that between the parts of your design on the fold that you leave a little space so that there's something still holding the structure of the paper together. So you can see here I'm cutting out reasonably slowly. So as we go on, I'm going to speed up the cutting. I just wanted the first one nice and slow, and you can see how I'm cutting out these parts. So there's the first one's cut out. I'm going to put it down, and always once you've cut a couple of elements, I always open up and see what it looks like. So obviously you're only looking at half. There we go. So straight away you can see it looks new and different. Okay, now I'm going to take a little look at the next design, which is this kind of crown from the family crest. I'm finding that a little complicated to look at. So if you remember, we did this last week where we folded the design in two. So we're only looking at half the design. And that makes it a lot easier to sketch the design onto our fold up cutout. So I'm going to look at what I think is a nice shape, which is this kind of, I think it's a flower, maybe a rosette, down the bottom. And as before, I draw the first shape that I find easy, which is the center bit. I'm going to kind of draw the petals, but I'm going to break them up a little bit in shapes because I don't want to cut too much out and have the whole thing fall out. So what I'm doing is trying to make it into something that will look like a nice shape, but that the paper structure will still hold together. You can see underneath I just drew a little shape in there that fits the space, and then I'm going to draw the top kind of curve shape that I see. So I'm not using everything from the one drawing, I'm mixing some of them together. And the more that you do this, the more the design becomes your own. So working from reference, which is what I call when you're looking at something as an inspiration for your design, the more you work on it, the less the original design is there, and it's more just a starting point. So you can see here I'm cutting nice and slowly, and I'm taking time to cut really carefully. So when you're cutting like this on a fold, you need to make sure you leave plenty of parts where you don't cut through the fold, as in you leave little joining parts that join one side of the paper to the other. Okay, so you might cut out lots of different pieces, but you need loads of those little, what I call joining sections in there. So they're the parts that I'm not cutting out. You can see I'm just cutting below one there. And sometimes it means that you divide your shapes up into more individual shapes, but you just need to make sure you leave enough structure there so the paper doesn't fall apart. What you will usually find is that as you start doing cutouts, you often cut through parts you don't mean to, and that's part of the learning process. So you'll often cut through something and you meant to keep it, so you can either tape it, so you can either use masking tape, which is like a paper tape on the back, or you can just start again and do a new one. And once you've done that once, you really don't do it twice. So now I've cut out the kind of rosette part that came from the family crest, and I'm going to open up. So every time you cut out one section, open up your page, because this is what your final artwork looks like. So you can see by using a bit of the design from the vase and a bit of design from the family crest, already I'm creating something that looks quite different. Now if I want to add to that, I'm folding a little bit to the side, and I'm going to add in another part of my design there. Okay, so I want to draw a bit of the crown design on there, but you can see I'm flipping the page around, and the reason I'm doing that is if I'm going to draw the design on, I want to make sure that where I draw it is not going to, I'm not going to cut out part of my original design by mistake. So I'm making sure to draw on the side where I can see what's already cut out, so that I don't cut over that and ruin it at the same time. So again, I'm just using that part cut drawing on the fold, and you can see each time I draw it, it looks different. So you alter it every time you work from reference, whether it be the original item or your own drawing, you change it a little bit, and that's no harm. So here, this bit is actually quite complicated, so I've sped it up really fast, so you don't have to watch lots of very slow cutting. So this is me cutting that part out and back to normal speed, and you can see what that looks like. Okay, so already it starts looking different from the original image, and you're starting to make your own design. So here, instead of working from reference, I'm just going to add in some shapes, and I'm going to add in a few shapes that go close to the center design and kind of skirt around the edge. So I always call this kind of mimicking the same shape, where you're going near the edge, cutting into it, and what you're doing is cutting out a shape that kind of links these two parts together. So you can see at the bottom there, the two parts are linked. Okay. Once I've done that, I realize that I'd like to make this a symmetrical pattern, which means it looks the same on either side. So I make a fold the same way, which was fold from the edge into the center, and I want to copy that design. So what I'm going to do is lay it over like this and draw on one side. So you can see here again, I've sped up. Every time I speed up, I'll write it on screen just so that you can see. And it just means that you're not going through lots of very slow activity, but you can see what's happening. So you can see I'm drawing only on one side. I only need it on one side so that I can cut out. And then I take my scissors and I cut out my design. So any bit that is going to be near the opposite side, I'm just being a little careful about that to make sure that it all fits in together. And then back to where I've drawn it. So I've obviously sped this up 4 times so I can do it nice and quickly. And what I'm doing is cutting out the same as the other side, so I have a nice symmetrical pattern that I think is going to work into a really nice artwork. So what you'll find is that the designs will look a little bit like something out of King House, but it won't look like any one thing. And using reference like we're using from King House, this is what you get. You get something that might fit well within the house, but doesn't look exactly like any one item in there. So now I'm going to try a second version, okay, using the same reference images but making something quite different. So again, I start by taking my A4 sheet, folding it in two, and I'm going to look up here at something I haven't used yet, which is, it's actually kind of from the helmet of the Connacht Rangers exhibition. And I'm just going to look at this, which is a harp within what looks kind of like a police design, but I'm going to see if I can simplify that design and make it something that might work. So you can see the first thing I drew is the simple shape, which is the circle on the inside. I'm drawing the other circle that goes around it, and I'm aware when cutting that I'm going to have to change a little bit as I cut that to make sure I can cut it out from the fold. So sometimes I draw the design and then work out a little bit more as I cut how I'm going to make something work. So I'm trying to draw shapes from the edge, and every time I do this you can see I'm breaking things down into shapes. I'm breaking them down into individual shapes that aren't attached to each other. And as I said before, the reason you don't attach them to each other is you're trying to make sure that you leave plenty of parts where the paper is connected to itself so it doesn't fall apart. So start cutting, and I'm going to cut the simplest shape first. The next thing I'm going to do is for that outer ring, I'm just going to cut it in a few parts. Here I'm going to add these kind of, I suppose they're like triangular shapes that make up this kind of police medal. And the same here, so I'm breaking shapes, even shapes that I drew as one. When I go to cut them, I'm breaking them down into slightly smaller parts. Okay, so in doing this, it's just to show you how you can take an original drawing, which is quite complicated, and maybe just use simple elements of it to get what you want. So in cutting this out, I'm double speed here. I'm using the helmet kind of medal, and I'm making something that isn't too far off it, but also has become its own thing. So if I look at that, I can look and think, you know, there's a few small things I could do that could make that a nice detail. So without even looking at reference, I can just cut a couple of shapes in here that I think will emphasize that and make it look more interesting. So a little bit like at the end of the last cutout, you start using your own imagination and your own shapes to add to what you think might work. Even here, in the middle of what's the crown part, I'm just going to add a little diamond there, and I might add a little thing that looks like a semicircle. Okay, these shapes don't need to be perfect. I'm just doing kind of a little simple cut in, and you can see by adding those small simple cuts, it's already a little bit more interesting. Now I'm going to speed it up again, and I'm going to add in some more shapes towards the bottom. So these aren't even any particular shapes, they're just ones that I think might look interesting. So now you can see when you open it up that we worked from the original police medallion from the helmet, but it's kind of become its own design at this stage. So what I want to do is I want to add some detail, but I want to add it a little closer to that central design. So I've made my next fold quite close, okay? And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to cut in close to that. The reason I'm doing that is I want to emphasize the central design. And with cutouts, the way that they work best is that if you have maybe large blocky cutout shapes next to very fine detailed cutout shapes. It's kind of a design principle that works in many things, but for cutouts it works particularly well. So you can see I'm cutting out quite large shapes while still making sure that I have connections on the fold that attach to each other. Here I'm going to speed up double to let me cut out the next few bits. So I'm going to replicate that on the other side. So I'm going to make a fold pretty much the same place. Not exactly, actually, I can see it's a little bit off, but even at that, I'm just going to make something very close to the same shape and open it up and see how I go. So with this, I am working probably a little bit less from the original design. I start with one really simple element of the King House design, but I'm adding an awful lot more of my own design elements as I go. And that's how the cutouts work. You can use lots and lots of the reference images from King House, or you can use a tiny bit of that and then add lots of your own as you go more. And you can see here I'm not even drawing on, so it's kind of like freestyling. So you can see here I've created quite a different one. So here I have my first design, which is very much based on items within King House, and the second design is less so. And really that's to show you two different ways you could look at this and the two different ways you could approach it. So I'd like you now to work away, make 3 or 4 of these if you could, and then next week we're going to assemble them to make a large individual cut paper sculpture.